Congratulations! You clicked on my left hand, thus choosing to explore through the lens of the rights and opportunities of white Americans. Are you ready to learn about the contraction and expansion of rights and opportunities through the era of the Progressive Age and the New Deal? I sure am. First, we'll explore through the Progressive Age. First and foremost, progressives believed that the modern era needed rethinking of the functions of political authority through fighting the power of pro-big business, protecting consumers, civilizing the marketplace, or granting industrial freedom. The Progressive Party platform demanded women's suffrage, federal supervision of corporate enterprises, national labor and health legislation for women and children, and an 8-hour day and a living wage for all workers. And lastly, a national system of social insurance which would cover unemployment, medical care, and old age. These demands were expressed through the state and federal level. In the state level, mayors and governors implemented progressive ideas into their programs. For example, Hazen Pingree, the mayor of Detroit from 1889 to 1897, battled the business interests that dominated over the city government, forced gas and telephone companies to lower their rates, and established a civic power plant. There was also Samuel Jones, the mayor of Toledo, Ohio. In his mayorship, he founded night schools and free kindergartens, built new parks, and supported the rights of workers to unionize, and lastly implemented an 8-hour workday and paid vacation in his city factories. Here you see the expansion of the opportunities that the Americans had with Samuel Jones. Following Samuel Jones, there was Hiram Johnson, the governor of California. He secured the passage of the Public Utilities Act, which was the railroad regulation measures, and he also banned child labor and limited work hours for women. However, here you see a contraction of women opportunities, for they had little work hours, thus getting less for profit. Lastly, there was Robert M. LaFollette, the elected governor of Wisconsin. He was for the nomination of candidates for office instead of political bosses. He was also for the taxation of the corporate wealth, and lastly for the state regulation of railroads and public utilities. On a federal note, there was Roosevelt and Taft, who boldly challenged the power of pro-big business. Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act against the Northern Securities Company. He also pushed for federal regulation of the economy through strengthening the Interstate Commerce Commission. Also, Roosevelt and the Congress passed acts such as the Hepburn Act, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to examine railroad business records and to place considerable rates. He also passed the Pure Food Act and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act, which established a federal agency to govern the quality of food and drugs. Following Roosevelt's presidency came Taft, who mainly focused on busting big businesses. He brought John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company to the Supreme Court, where he accused the big business to be in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and to order its breakup into separate markets. He also pursued the American tobacco industry for driving smaller firms out of business. He also promoted the graduate income tax and stuff like that. Through all these acts passed by federal and state levels, progressivism ultimately helped expand the opportunities of Americans that fell victim of policies during the pro-big business laissez-faire era. Last but not least came Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson believed in his program for the New Freedom, which was the federal government strengthening antitrust laws, protecting the rights of workers to unionize, and encouraging small businesses. Once elected president, he enacted several acts in order to implement his version of progressivism. These acts included the Underwood Tariff, which reduced duties on imports, and a graduate income tax on the richest 5% of Americans. The Clayton Act, which freed labor unions from antitrust laws and barred courts from issuing injunctions about the right to strike. The Keaton-Owen Act, which outlawed child labor in the manufacture of goods. The Adamson Act, which established an 8-hour workday on the nation's railroads. And lastly, the Warehouse Act, which extended credit to farmers whose crops were in federally licensed warehouses. He also founded the Federal Reserve System that consisted of 12 regional banks, in which handled the distribution of money, aiding banks in danger of failing, and influencing interest rates to promote economic growth. All of these acts in total all helped Americans with industrial freedom during the time. Now, let's explore the rights and opportunities of Americans during the New Deal. During the New Deal era, Roosevelt's policies helped expand the economically challenged civilians to get back from the effects of the Great Depression, thus expanding the opportunities for economic success. FDR's first and second deal did just that. Firstly, he implemented the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was a government system that insured the accounts of individual depositors. Roosevelt also took off the U.S. from the gold standard, thus severing the link between country currency and the gold reserves, and therefore putting more money into circulation, jump-starting businesses. Furthermore, FDR enacted this following act, NRA, which stood for National Industrial Recovery Act, which worked with groups of business leaders to establish industry codes that set standards for output prices and working conditions, thus ending cutthroat competition and antitrust laws. FDR also made a new law that recognized the right for workers to organize unions, which was a major departure from the open shop policies of the 1920s and a step towards government support for what workers call industrial freedom. He also enacted these following acts, which included the CCC, which stood for Civilian Conservation Corps, which placed unemployed young men to work on projects such as forest preservation, flood control, and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserve. Also, he enacted the PWA, which was the Public Work Administration, which built roads, schools, hospitals, and other public facilities. Following the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, which employed more than 4 million persons in the construction of highways, tunnels, courthouses, and airports. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built a series of dams to prevent floods and deforestation along the Tennessee River, and to provide cheap electric power for homes and factories with families that lived in isolated log cabins. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which authorized the federal government to try to raise farm prices by setting production quotas for major crops and paying farmers to plant more. And lastly, the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, which hired 3 million Americans. In the second New Deal, FDR emphasized that the national government had a responsibility to see to it of the well-being of ordinary Americans. In order to do so, FDR enacted the Social Security Act, which was a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid to the disabled and the elderly poor and families with dependent children. The first New Deal greatly positively impacted the opportunities of Americans, for Americans were greatly devastated by the effects of the Great Depression. Now that we explored of the major improvements of the opportunities of Americans, let's examine the contemporary issues of Americans. We see the change of opportunities recently changed in our era, specifically in the 2008 Great Recession. The 2008 Great Recession was triggered from many factors such as easy credit conditions, which resulted in high-risk lending and borrowing practices without contemplating the risk already, international trade imbalances, the real estate bubbles, which was a rapid increase of the pricing of property which has busted, economic policies about government expenses, and nations helping failing banks and bondholders. The Great Recession led to laying off of many U.S. employees and foreclosure to many people that could not pay mortgages. The Great Recession parallels the Great Depression with its causes and effects greatly, and ultimately demonstrates the loss of opportunities given to Americans.